So with your permission today, I'm going to start my first sermon with a question. Why are we here? Why are we here? Why did we get up so early on a beautiful Sunday morning to be at Redeemer Lutheran Church at 9:30 a.m.?
You're done at work.
I can think of a couple of reasons why people might have come today. Some people might have heard that there's a new guy in town. And they might have showed up to find out whether this guy can actually preach. Or maybe they just showed up to see whether they'd like him or not. I hope not, but maybe someone showed up to find out whether the new vicar was tall, single, and handsome. You get what you see. 3 strikes, you're out. Sorry. Now, there might be another reason, and I don't expect this to be the case, but maybe someone came to find out whether he would say something that they would disagree with. Something that they could hold against him. Most of you, like you've already answered to me, said, Vicar, this is our church. We're supposed to be here on a Sunday morning. Where else would we be? Well, let me ask you another question then. Did you come here expecting something? Did you come here expecting something from Jesus? Did you come here because you desperately needed something? In our gospel reading this morning, Mark tells us about a large crowd that was following Jesus around one day. Why? Have you ever stopped to think, why was this crowd following him around? I mean, they were crowding him so much that sometimes there wasn't even room for him to move. Well, so far through the first 5 chapters of his book, Mark has told us a few reasons why there might be a crowd following Jesus. The first reason might be that they had heard about the healings, about the miracles that Jesus had been doing in Galilee. They might also have heard about the exorcisms, about the demons that Jesus had cast out of people. They weren't there. This crowd was not there following Jesus because they needed anything from him. They were there just so that they could say, I was there. I saw it happen. They were there to be entertained. They wanted to see a show. Now there was a second group that was probably following Jesus this day. Now Mark doesn't tell us for sure, but I'm pretty sure that there was a group of leaders from the temple in Jerusalem following him around. Now see, he had collectively already gotten under their skin by healing a man on the Sabbath and by claiming authority to forgive sins. Now that may not sound like a big deal to us in 21st century America. I forgive you. But to a first century Jew who understood the very proper distinction between the Creator and a creature, they knew that a sin was an act of treason against the Creator, and that only the Creator had the authority to forgive that creature their sins. Who was this guy? Who was this creature walking around claiming equal authority with the Creator? Who was this Jesus? You see, these leaders, they were listening, they were watching, They were waiting for Jesus to say one thing, anything against the law of Moses. against the prophets. You see, this was their job. It was their job, after all, to protect the people from false teachers, from false prophets. And they were going to do their job. They were going to do it well. Judah was not going back into exile, not on their watch. There's another group, a third group, much smaller group, that was following Jesus that day. It was his disciples. And along with the disciples, we would include the 12. And of course the 12 were there. Where else would they be? Jesus was their teacher. He called us. He called us to follow him, to learn. Where else would we be? And in addition to the 12, there were likely other people that were following who were there to hear his teachings. They were the only ones, they thought, who actually really belonged there. I don't know what this other crowd's doing here. But of the three groups that we've talked about so far, the big crowd, the Pharisees and the leaders, and the disciples, of those three, who among them was there because they needed something from Jesus? None. Zip, zilch. If they had chosen to be somewhere else that day, their life would have gone on just fine and dandy. Thank you very much. But there were two people. Two people in the crowd that day that were desperate. They needed Jesus that morning. The first was Jairus. Jairus was a leader of a local synagogue. Jairus, his 12-year-old daughter, was sick. And we're not talking about a simple cold, a cough, some sniffles. She was really sick. Think about this. Jairus, the leader of the synagogue, he knew who Jesus was. He knew the reputation Jesus had for breaking the Sabbath laws. And he knew that the leaders from Jerusalem would be watching. Even by associating with Jesus, by asking Jesus to come to his house, Jairus was risking his own reputation. He might have been risking his job in the synagogue. But we're talking about his only daughter. She was dying. He didn't care what they thought. It was worth the risk to him that morning. The second person that desperately needed Jesus that day was a woman. Mark doesn't tell us what her name was, but he does tell us that she had an issue of blood. And it had been there for 12 years, constant, every day. Now, you and I probably tend to think about just the physical illness that this woman was suffering from. But for a first century Jewish woman, this illness had serious implications for her place in society and her place in the religious status. She was an exile, a virtual exile in her own town. Mosaic law said that during a woman's cycle, she was ceremonially unclean. for that period and also for the 7 days following. Couldn't go to the temple, couldn't go to the synagogue. Leviticus 15 says that she couldn't even be touched by anybody. Whoever touched her, whoever touched anything that she was sitting on, whoever touched anything that she had laid on, would become unclean also. She was probably risking her life being out in a crowd that day. If she had touched anybody and they had found out, they might have stoned her to death. But she was desperate. It was worth the risk to her that morning. She was going to be discreet. She wasn't going to draw attention to herself. She was just going to sneak up behind him and just touch part of Jesus' clothes. No one would know. And when Jesus stopped and turned around and said, "Who touched me?" Can you imagine what she felt? She could have just kind of drifted back into the crowd and said nothing. She could have tried to slip away. But those 12 years with that illness had broken her. She didn't care anymore what people thought. She didn't care what happened to her. All she knew was that she was healed. After 12 years, she was healed. Nothing else mattered anymore. Now, she may not have cared what happened to her, but there was a person in the crowd that should have cared. Jairus, the guy standing next to Jesus, the guy that was inviting Jesus to come to his house. The leader of the synagogue. Not only was he inviting a guy who continuously broke the Sabbath laws to come to his house, now he was inviting an unclean person to come to his house. If he had touched Jesus, if Jesus had touched him, Jairus would have been ceremonially unclean. And yet, Jairus said nothing. His only thought was still for his daughter. If she died, nothing else would matter. Jesus had compassion on these two people. He healed the woman. He raised Jairus' daughter from the dead. Gave her life. But Jesus knew that these physical needs were not their greatest need. Jesus knew that even though the crowd was just there to see a show, they desperately needed him too. The Pharisees desperately needed Jesus that day. And even though the disciples didn't know it, the disciples needed Jesus that day. Excuse me. You see, Jesus knew that the only way that these people could be restored back into a right relationship with his Father was for him to go to the cross, to die, and 3 days later, to rise from the dead. So, let me ask you again. Why are we here today? So often we come to church for the wrong reasons. Now, it's not a bad thing for the crowd to have been following Jesus that day. They could have been doing a lot worse stuff. It's not a bad thing for us to be in church on Sundays. We could be doing a lot worse stuff. But why? Why are we here? Let me share with you, maybe you can relate to some of the reasons why I come to church on Sunday mornings. Sometimes I come to church because I care about what other people might think about me if I skip. Especially as a vicar now, I think that might be a bad thing, right? Sometimes I come just because it's my habit. This is what I do. I get up on Sunday morning and I go to church. But there's sometimes when I'm just tired. I don't feel good. Or I just don't feel like going. But I get up and I go anyway because it's a habit. It's the right thing to do. Let me share, though, maybe a better reason to come to church on Sunday morning. Because we desperately need Jesus. We should come here because we need Jesus. We should be as desperate as Jairus was. We should be as desperate as that woman to be touched by Jesus. And just like those two people, we should be willing to risk everything. See, we have the same need that they had. The same need that the Pharisees had, that the crowd had, the disciples. Without the grace that Jesus has won for us, we're dead. Yeah, okay, sure. We may still be breathing. There may still be a pulse. Our heart may still be beating. But unless we believe that Jesus' life, death, and resurrection has won for us the forgiveness of our sins, we are not truly alive. Not the way God created us to be. Now, some of you might say, well, you know, the gospel reading, that's different. Jesus was right there. Jairus could see him. The lady could touch him. They could hear him. We can't do that today. That's fair enough. You're right. Jesus is not present with us in the same way that he was on that morning. And Jesus told us that that's a good thing. Instead of being limited to one place, one physical place at one time, as he did when he walked the earth, instead he's promised that wherever two or more are gathered in his name, anywhere in the world at any time, he's there. And when we look up here at the table and we see bread and wine, in a few minutes when we approach this table, Jesus has promised to be right there. Right there in the bread and the wine. Right there, he has promised to give us forgiveness, life, and salvation. And isn't that what we desperately need. Even if sometimes we act like we don't know it. We constantly need Jesus to give us healing. We constantly need Jesus to forgive our sins, to give us life. And He's promised to do it right there. So let me ask you again. What are you willing to risk? What are you willing to risk to see a loved one come to faith and be given life? Jairus was willing to give up his reputation, lose his job. What are you willing to risk to be healed by Christ? That woman was willing to give up her life. What are you willing to give up to be counted with Jesus? That's how we should approach Him. That's why we should come here every week, every day. That's how we should approach our Lord. And we should come with absolute certain expectation. We should always expect Jesus to change us, to transform us. We should always come with that expectation. If we don't expect Jesus to meet us here, to change us, then why are we here? He's promised to always be here. He's promised us that the Spirit will always live inside of us. He's promised the Spirit will always give us comfort, will always teach us, that the Spirit will be constantly interceding for us. And all of those promises we know He's going to keep. Why? Because the one who promised is the same one who is risen. And He is risen indeed.